Our program starts in 1933, only a few months after the EEs were first assigned to commuter trains in Cincinnati. Here, one of them is pulling into an outlying suburb with a commuter train. Another pulls in from the opposite direction, now facing the correct direction. Back then, the commuters were very frequent, as trains were the main way to travel. This shot illustrates that. The previously seen EE pulls out of the station, while another, tender first, rounds the corner and pulls in before the first train is even out of view. Our photographer rushes to the platform to catch it depart. Now we see a coal train, led by two N&W in-house built Y6Bs. This was back when Cincinnati was still N&W trackage. Now another commuter pulls in, this time with a rare at this point USRA 282 in the lead. These were common on freight trains still, but they had been virtually obsoleted on commuters by the EEs by this point. This was the last one in service. This was one of its final runs before its eventual reassigning to freight service. Now it's 1943, the middle of the war years. Commuters came less and freight trains came more often, as freight was more vital to the war effort. However, the working people of America still needed to get to their jobs, so the commuter parade didn't stop. Here an EE is pulling into the station. This is a farther away view of it heading around a corner. Back in the station, another commuter with a tender first EE pulls in and soon enough departs. As it does so, an N&W oil train sneaks by, missing the cameras by going behind the coaches. A single Y6B is in the lead. Moments later, a soldier's train screams through the station without stopping, with an N&WJ in the lead. Just outside the station once again, a correctly facing EE pulls in and comes to a stop. The photographer rushes to the end of the platform to catch the departure. As that train pulls out, a proper N&W coal train pulls in, again with two Y6Bs at the helm. These engines were good pullers. This coal train is probably longer than the ones we have today. Now we cut to the most interesting time, 1946. American Railroads was brand new and the war had just ended. Most engines, like this EE pulling into the station, remained on their same duties, as American railroads didn't really have a reason to swap them out just yet. The standardization policy at this point was just an idea in someone's head, and locomotives from different railroads intermingled randomly. Here, a USRA 282 chuffs through its old commuter stomping grounds, now relegated to freight service. An EE-powered commuter pulls into and then departs from the station. A tender first EE pulls in with another commuter as an N&W coal train screams by unexpectedly, with two more Y6Bs for power. This was also a time of tests for American railroads. Locomotives from different rosters of the previous railroads were moved around to see what would perform best on what routes. Here we see a UP late Challenger testing on a coal train. Here we get our first views of yard action. Another relocated engine is this Burlington Route R2-262 switcher. These were originally designed as industrial engines, but were later found out to be able to do an assortment of jobs. Late into the day, we see the Challenger on its return trip. It wasn't nearly as powerful as the Y6B and couldn't handle the train. As such, one had to help it on its way back. Now we jump ahead exactly 10 years to 1956, right after the standardization policy was put into effect. Most commuter trains were still hauled by EEs like the ones shown. However, the new 314 class, borrowed from the Canadian Pacific Railway, were starting to take over. One enters the station here. It's pulling the same amount of commuter cars, but they are packed, as commuters want to ride behind the new engine. Here, one departs from the station, going tender first. These engines were selected as good commuter candidates because of their ability to run backwards easily. The coal trains were also affected by the changes. This one is pulled by two, ironically older than the Y6Bs, USRA 2882s. Despite the commuters' enthusiasm, local rail fans were quite disappointed to find their famous EEs being replaced. It was now the Cold War, though. Russian locomotives were obviously hated on by the general public. To the delight of a rail fan, though, one came around the bend tender first. Normal freight trains were also affected by the changes. Here, one of the Santa Fe 3879 Class 210-2 Santa Fe's roars in. It's going slowly, but it's pulling a long drag freight, so that's about standard. This was the first time one of these pulled into Cincinnati. Back at the yard, we see the CB&Q R2 again, and it's passed by another commuter with a tender first 314. The R2 starts up and goes into the yard to begin its work. However, today, it's not just switching cars around the yard. It has to go down the line to a local coal station to fill up a few cars with coal before heading back to the yard. As the engine pulls out of the yard, the points are switched to send it down the small local run. Our photographer gets quite excited as he has never seen an R2 go down this route before. As a result, he hops into his car and takes the local roads down to where the line connects with them. Here, the engine is passing by a construction site and logging facility. It's hauling a long set of cars here, much more than a typical R2 would be able to haul. It's been especially modified with sandboxes once it arrived at the yard to allow it to perform these duties flawlessly. We catch up with the train once more as it heads under an overpass and through a railroad crossing. By the time we catch up again, the train is stopped at the mine. The cars are still blocking the crossing until the R2 gives them a solid bump and heads through the crossing, clearing the road. We catch it one more time on its way back to the yard. The tripod was set up for this shot inside a horse pen. Must have been pretty inconvenient for the photographer. Back at the yard, the coal hoppers are placed into the sidings, waiting to be picked up later on another train for distribution. Now we take a look at the locomotive shops. 5 of the 10 EMs are here in storage, hopefully waiting their next assignment, although they never actually left. There's also an NNW Y6B in the storage line. Inside the shops is a Santa Fe 3789 and 2 USRA 2882s. The 3879 roars into life and heads out of the locomotive shops with a nice display of steam from the cylinders. Soon after, another tender first EE pulls into the station with a commuter. Now, a 3879 powered oil train pulls into the yard with a special surprise. Behind the 3879 is a 314 class. This is another one which has come to replace one of the remaining 5 EEs on the commuter trains. Our photographer heads over to the station while the coupling between the 314 and the first tanker is unfastened. Finally, the two engines roar into life and head across the yard so that the 3879 can switch the 314 onto another track so it can go back to pick up the rest of the oil train and continue along its journey. After dropping off the engine, the 3879 heads back around the siding and past the 314 again to recouple to its oil train before its departure from the yard. It wasn't dropping off any freight here, aside from the locomotive. A few days later, we find that the R2 is no more, as the SU that was replaced by that 314 has now taken on its job as the yard switcher. We jump ahead 2 years to 1958. Now we're viewing the switching SU leave its shed and head into the yard to begin the day's switching work. By this point, the SUs were completely obsoleted on commuter trains, and 314s were the only engines employed on those. Only 2 SUs remained in service, One was the yard switcher, and the other was a backup, which was used only for spare parts to keep the one running. Here it's moving a cut of grain hoppers from one siding into another. Now we view the actual shed. As you can see, most of it is occupied by 314s, with only a single 3879 and another static SU. After a while, a 314 leaves the shed to go and pull the second commuter train of the day. One has already left. The engine scuttles about the yard and eventually connects to its coaches and leaves, so it can switch onto the main line and back into the station. While that was happening, the SU had finished switching its grain hoppers onto that different siding, and is now leaving so it can go pick up the boxcars seen here in the middle siding. While that switching is happening, the previous 314 backs its train into the station to pick up that morning rush hour's second loader of commuters. Now the train is fully boarded, and with a toot of its whistle, the 314 hauls the train out of the station, past its predecessor. After the commuter clears, the SU is free to continue his switching. Another commuter that previously left the yard pulls out of the station with a roar. Meanwhile, the SU has come to a stop, waiting for clearance, as a 3879 backs out of the shed and heads into the yard to pick up the freight that the SU had just assembled. Meanwhile, the SU has got its clearance and moves out of the way to clear for the 3879. Now coupled up to its train, the engine roars into life and departs the yard with lots of steam shooting from the cylinders, a characteristic 3879 trait. Back on the main line, it's been a few hours since the 3879 departed, and a coal train is screaming through. Although a normal USRA 2882 is in the lead, an older NNW Y6B is in second. These were getting incredibly rare by this point, and so it was time for a chase. Now, it's August 11th, 1959. The EEs have now been completely obsoleted, even in yard service, by another pair of 314s. The two EEs were fired up for the final time for an NRHS-sponsored Farewell to the EEs excursion. There was a large crowd at the station on this day as the two EEs pulled out of the yard and onto the main line. As they exited sight, their replacement came into view, hauling a commuter train. Down at the curve next to the station, the train was halted until the two EEs jolted it into motion and pushed it back into the station and into the platform where the enthusiasts were loaded in. Our photographer only bought a ticket for the return trip, though, as he would be chasing the train in his car for the way there. As the train was boarded, a coal train headed by, predictably with a pair of USRA 2882s at the front. And, with that, the two EEs roared out of the station. This would be the final time they would ever depart from it pulling a train. The chase begins as our photographer races down to the retaining wall around the S-bend. The EEs roar around the corner and head underneath the photographer. After they pass, a typical 314 powered commuter heads by in the other direction. With barely any stops to make and two engines for better acceleration, the special excursion was able to reach speeds much higher than a standard commuter train. This shot gives a good view of just how many coaches were on this train, more than double the standard amount on a commuter. When they reached the final station, a 314 had been posed for photos. The two EEs slowly lumbered in. This would be their final time stopping at this station with a commuter train. After pausing briefly to wait for its photos to be taken, the 314 commuter headed out of the station. There was no more stations to go to, but it had to go forwards to clear the line. The two EEs then raced forwards, switched onto the other line, and headed backwards, switched again, and headed back onto the other end of the train for the return journey. With our photographer now in the train, an SU-powered American Railroad's commuter train departed a station for the final time. Shortly after departing, the pair rounded a curve and headed into a tunnel. Our photographer was running out of film at this point, so there isn't much of the return journey. A different photographer, with a black and white camera, captured the two pulling into the station for the final time. If you look over to where they are, you can see the very end of another commuter that just departed the station. With the screech of their brakes, the two EEs stopped at the station. As far as the public knew anyway, this was the end of the EE era on American railroads. However, there was one that decided his time was not up. One that decided he was going to become a legend. One named Ronald. That very night, still on August 11th, 1959, Ronald's driver sneaked up to him in the yard. Ronald was the engine trailing on the final EE excursion, and he was in the best mechanical condition. He had developed a strong bond with his driver over the years of operating, and so, when he was withdrawn, his driver was having none of it. He sneaked into the yard very late at night, thankfully recording the scenes with his film camera. Ronald wanted to save the USRA 282 and 462 that were in the yard awaiting their scrap, so they picked those up. After that, they rushed out of their yard on to bigger and better horizons to try and save as many locomotives as they could. One rail fan who heard the commotion and didn't understand what was going on headed out to see what it was. He brought his camera with him too. He snapped the only known photo of Ronald's escape and took a video. This was the true end of the EEs in Cincinnati. However, Ronald wouldn't be leaving forever, as he would return to Cincinnati a few more times.